G'day, I've been your imaginary underworld apostate, not Jar Witness, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
The other possibility is, once the 8 Ball tells us there was no Jesus, the other possibility, I think, would be that the community that Paul got it from had invented Jesus as a mythical character. Paul maybe misunderstood and thought Jesus was a real person, and still saw that idea of the crucified Jesus as his reason to change Judaism.
Sure, I think it's plausible historically to imagine a guy like Paul walking around. Let's think about the world Paul lives in, right? First century Palestine. You live in a demon-haunted world, right? Mm-hmm. You live in a place where there are magicians and there are miracles and there's myth and magic all around you, and you don't use the word myth because that doesn't exist for you. That's just a reality that you can't see, but it's absolutely real for you. So Paul's walking around and he's persecuting, and let's just take at face value that Paul persecutes Christians in favor of Orthodox Judaism or non-Christian Judaism.
Okay, let me pause you there. If you're going down that trail, then you've already conceded that Paul didn't invent Jesus.
No, I'm not. No,
somebody else invented Jesus.
No, I'm actually going in a different direction.
Okay,
and then Paul struggles with what he's doing, and maybe he finds fault and the persecuting of Christians. He doesn't feel good about it. He feels guilt. I don't know, something. Maybe he is schizophrenic, maybe not, who knows. Maybe he is epileptic and has visions, or maybe not, who knows. But at some point he hears stories about magic that was done, or miracles or healing or something, and those stories may or may not have been about Jesus. But what we know right now is that Paul was acting against Christians. And we don't have anybody else who's written anything about it yet. And Paul comes to associate all of the magic things that he's heard with this idea who is Jesus, and becomes the first guy to actually write it down. Now, you're right, I've kicked the can down the road a little bit. Other people are already, there are other Jesus worshipers. If we take that at face value, then there are other Jesus worshipers already in Paul's time. It could be that he made that up. I guess what I would say is whoever the first person was to make a Jesus is a real person, or was a real person claim, could have heard the stories of other people and just in that person's mind said, I wonder if this could be the Yeshua dude that I heard about. But there still has to be a Yeshua.
But the heard about somebody came up with that.
It's still in the background. It's hard to pin that down. Now, ultimately, for me, it seems the criterion of embarrassment and the fact that I can't find a good, plausible, historically driven way to come up with a solution that gives us a Jesus claim without there having been a Jesus. I mean, some make-believe thing. The tooth fairy.
So
right?
if Paul made it up, then Paul also made up the story of earlier Christians.
Yeah.
I mean, axiomatically, if Paul made it up, then he also made up the story of Jesus' life.
Is that likely?
Now, it's worth pointing out that most of what we think we know about Jesus we don't get from Paul. So but at least the basic four corners we know from Paul: born of a woman, Nazareth,
had brothers.
One of them was named James.
Crucified.
Resurrection. So the basic outline of Jesus's earthly life we get from Paul. If Paul made up Jesus, then Paul made that up as well. And then everything else, including the narrative, could be embellishments by later followers.
True.
That's possible. So what do you think is another compelling, if the next thing the 8 Ball tells us is that Paul didn't make it up, that Paul got it from somebody that previously believed it, what do you think is the next most likely source of the story? Do you have another theory?
Not really. Do you?
No.
So it's a good question. I would really like to ask Dr. Carrier. He'll be here in a little while. He'll be here in less than an hour. If Paul didn't make it up, where did it come from? So at some point, somebody has to make it up. And what were the reasons that person did? So the argument I've heard, the cargo cults in the Polynesian islands, it's It's an example of a completely made up guy. And I don't even think that's a really good example. I mean, I get the analogy. I just don't think it's a good example. I'm hard pressed to it. And let's go to the criterion of embarrassment. If you're going to make up a story about a deity who came to Earth and walked around, why would you execute that deity? It would be like a modern person making up a story about their deity who was executed in an electric chair. I mean, really, that's what we're talking about.
Well, okay, but you know, the idea of sacrifice atoning for sins was not new. I mean,
I get that.
You've got religions on every continent that are slaughtering animals or even humans.
I get that, but
to appease the gods.
I can think of if I'm going to make it up, I can think of a better story than there being a sacrifice.
Okay, but Owen, we have religions on every continent that are sacrificing humans and animals. So the fact that you could make up a better story doesn't mean that humans didn't make up these stories.
I get that.
So I don't know that that's an argument for or against. Now, I don't think that Jews were likely to make up a story about God becoming man and being sacrificed, because that wasn't part of any part of even the messianic traditions before the time of Jesus. And I still think that the crucifixion is definitely in my top 5 list of things that make me think that Jesus was historical character. But the idea that no one would make up a story like that.
So what are the other 5 things? Nazareth. I don't think, if I made up a guy, I don't think I'd put him in Nazareth.
Nazareth, his family rejecting him, Jesus getting angry. I think the conflict between the Gospels is almost evidence of historicity. You know, the fact that if this was an orchestrated conspiracy, you know, Joseph Smith could write the Book of Mormon from cover to cover and not contradict himself because he had a human author, right?
Right.
He knew he was making up all these characters. So let's shift gears a second. We just got done with an election.
We did.
Earlier this month, a few days ago actually. And this got me thinking about political association and religious association. And you and I both know a lot of Christians and a lot of atheists. Most of the Christians that I know, certainly the fundamentalist evangelical sorts of Christians that we encounter here in the Bible Belt, are also politically conservative. And in fact, let's be even more specific. They're Republicans. So in this part of the world,
not all, but
if you are a conservative Christian, you are overwhelmingly likely to vote Republican.
Right.
The polls show it, and my own personal experience shows it. You and I also know a lot of atheists, a lot of former Christian, former fundamentalist atheists who now, by and large or exclusively, vote Democrat. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing to me about this is that if you have conversations with Christians, some of them will tell you that their Christianity informs their political stance. But in a lot of cases, they will actually go to some effort to deny that and say, no, yes, I'm a Christian, but I embrace, either libertarianism or Republican Party politics because XYZ. Like they will give you reasoned reasons for their political stance and try to distance it from their religious stance. And I encounter some atheists that do the same thing. Yes, I don't believe in God. Yes, I don't believe in the Bible or Christianity or Jesus, but I also, am largely aligned with the Democratic Party on public policy questions and economic questions, and not see a tie between those things. So there's an enormous correlation in my experience, but there's less willingness to say that the one informs the other. And so I'm wondering, we've seen this happen where someone will lose their religion and you can almost set a watch that their political views are going to change.
It took me a long time.
It took you a long time. And you will probably say, well, that wasn't the reason. You'll have a different story. So I'm always curious about these people who abandon religion but remain, let's say, on the right side of the spectrum politically, and I'm wondering if that's just a matter of time, or if there's a point of no return where you've held a view for too long and you're not going to change your view.
So I think that the point of no return is momentum matters, right? Mm-hmm. And at some point, letting go of this idea that there is a deity frees your brain to go explore other things. Once you have questioned that most fundamental of assumptions that is present in certainly in our society, that you are certainly free to go ask other deep questions of other things that matter to you. But a lot of it has to do with the community and the bubble that people live in. And, you know, if you are a libertarian, I was a libertarian variety atheist for many years. And this is no longer true. But even that, like even you, we've only been friends, what, 3, 4, 5 years? Mm-hmm. And you've even seen some of this evolution happening just in the last 2 or 3. One really has to embrace this idea that every assumption should be questioned, every first principle that you think that you have, that you think is reliable, and that is a guaranteed true way to frame a worldview and to ask questions of a worldview, you've got to question all of those assumptions. Only when you question those assumptions are you enabled to let go. And I would argue that once a person is able to go ask deeper, harder questions about religion, can one really begin to ask deeper, harder questions about the conservatism that seems to flow from that religion.
Well, and one of the things too is that a lot of people will say they fooled me once, they're not going to fool me again.
Right.
Like if my parents told me we believe in Jesus and we vote Republican, you know, and here's Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Once you realize that one of those or 2 of those or 3 of those are not true, I think that, you know, a curious person, an intellectually honest person will say, I'm going to go look into this other thing my parents told me too.
Yeah.
And maybe some of that's what's going on, or what Fox News told me, or whatever.
Yeah.
It might be an interesting thing to have a future discussion with a person who was formerly religious and politically conservative, who's now not religious and not politically conservative like you and I. To have that conversation with someone who is no longer religious but is still sort of Fox News GOP. And I know a few of these people.
Here's what I would have told you 8 years ago. You know, I voted for George W. Bush. I'm destroying our brand. I'm sorry.
Safe word.
I'm no, just admit it. So I voted for Bush twice. I voted for McCain in the primary, but I voted for W in the elections. I voted for McCain. I voted for, which means I also voted for Sarah Palin. I'm sorry.
How'd that turn out for you?
Did not well. Or actually pretty good. Barack Obama was really an exceptional.
Let me assure you, in Texas, your vote didn't matter. So.
Right, that's true. Okay. Barack Obama was an extraordinarily good president. I voted for Romney and Ryan when they ran. In the last general election, I voted for the Libertarian candidates. The guy who didn't know.
Well, this is confession hour with Owen.
Maybe it is a bit, but I'm a Democrat. I have 2 Beto signs in my yard. I've got a sticker on my car.
So Owen is a recently metamorphosed.
I have changed a lot. So there are a couple of things that are happening. Right. First is when you begin to engage in the atheist community, you are to a significant degree moving outside of a libertarian or independent bubble, because now really the social progressives are all around you. And that has a way of forcing you to continue to ask questions. And I had some other things happening too. Ultimately, for me, the shift, and it's fascinating, I kind of enjoy talking about it. The first principle that I had that I could always go to, and there were several, but the first principle I had was that it is an absolute slam dunk that a person is entitled to the output of their own work. I thought that with that first principle, it was like feeding in a situation. Whatever the output was, that was my output, because I had a first principle that gave me a rule that was easy to live by. And it wasn't until I really started questioning that assumption that I was able to finally shake loose of that. And it took a surprisingly long time. But for me, let's just make an analogy here. Let's call life a race, okay? If life is a race, then some people are born separated from the finish line by an entire ocean. And some people are born with 1 foot already across the finish line.
And you had no control over that.
Right, and you had no control over it. The disparities in opportunity are so enormous. But not just that, the disparities in capability. Not every human being is capable of being a brain surgeon or a jet pilot, like I am.
Right.
So
on most days.
On most days. So the disparity of opportunity and capability led me to eventually at long last to recognize that that first premise really isn't a lockdown guaranteed thing, and that real life is more complicated than that. And I go back to something that Barack Obama said, and when he said it, it really bothered me, but now I get it. Sometimes you have to say, yes, I am my brother's keeper, and
you didn't build that,
and you didn't build that. Wow, when he said that,
the billionaire that started a company and had some great idea and made a lot of money deserves a lot of that money.
Deserves a lot of it.
But he used the public roads. He hired employees that were educated in public schools. He has the safety of operating our country because of the military funded by the public. So
exactly.
So there is I'm sure he uses the postal system. I'm sure all these things.
Right,
So there is a public
infrastructure
that we the people made available to that person
and it is on that landscape that success was achieved. Right. I don't want to take away from the success. I'm still a business person.
Right. And so there's the pragmatic problem for this public policy discussion is how do you bring about as much possible flourishing of the masses, but not to the point where you discourage innovation. And the concentration of wealth to the top 1% is so immense at this point that we're nowhere near that line.
Yeah.
We could bring that line way down and still have this problem, and not have this problem.
So I think you've heard me talk about this before. The capacity of the American economy to provide surplus means is extraordinary. And and the analogy I put on Facebook once was the medal race at each Olympics. Why is it that the United States, we're a reasonably large country, 300 million people, but in terms of land mass and other things, there are much larger countries out there. And yet the United States wins the medal race at almost every Olympics. And why is that? And the answer is, truthfully, that we have an economy with such excess capacity that we can afford to fund things like Olympic teams that do nothing but play hockey, or nothing but gymnastics, or ice skating, or track and field. And there are people whose entire life is devoted to being the very best swimmer that a human body can be. And so that if our economy can do things like that, if our economy can support a space program that sends people to the moon, if our economy can be the strongest in the world, then I would also respectfully submit that our economy should also do things like make sure that there are no children that are hungry tonight. Our economy should also make sure that any sick kid out there has access to visit a doctor and get some medicine.
Well, I would say it's not even just a charitable. It's not even just the right thing to do from a charitable point. It's the right investment to make. If you invested in early childhood education, secondary and college education, the way some of our rival countries do, then you'd be turning out a better educated workforce.
Yes,
so the fact that we cut that. Makes me think that we aren't that interested in winning that race.
It convinces me of that.
Right.
And ultimately, this is the libertarian idea, and I hear it said sometimes that all taxation is theft. It kills me. You can't say that and still accept the protection of the fire department right around the corner, who's gonna come when you call, whether you think that your taxes are theft or not.
Right. Whether you've even paid your taxes yet.
Right. Whether you paid your taxes or not.
So there was I had experience in childhood around the question of patriotism. You talked about how private property was one of your lever points. For me, patriotism was, you and I were both born in 1973.
Within 12 days apart.
One of my earliest memories was from 1976. In 1976, when I was 3 years old, it was July 4th, 1976. It was the bicentennial of the United States of America, celebrating the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Go America!
Giving King George the middle finger and declaring ourselves a new nation. I was surrounded by red, white, and blue in 1976. So my earliest memories of being a human are my memories of being an American, and the songs that we sang, and the flags and the parades and the fireworks. And I remember, the Air Force band doing this big concert with all these patriotic songs, and it was steeped in me that we are Americans, and the idea of patriotism was steeped in me. And one of the things we did every single day in school, we started the day by pledging allegiance to the flag of
To
the
the
United
flag.
States, to the flag, allegiance. And you know, what does a 4 or 5-year-old know about pledging allegiance?
These are words.
I don't even know what it means, right? But
Right.
it was so important that it was the one thing that we did every day all year long. We didn't study the same chapter in the math book every day all year long. We moved on. We didn't study any other
Pledge of
subject that way.
Allegiance.
But the pledge, which is supposedly this solemn vow, needed to be repeated 24 hours later because you might have forgotten. And I never really questioned any of this, right? Patriotism was a virtue. When we were growing up, we were told patriotism is a virtue. The more patriotic you are, the more you love your country, the more you put your country first, the better. And as I moved away from religion, I don't know where the cause and effect was, but I started feeling less and less like I should be loyal to America, and more like I should be loyal to the whole world, right? I'm a citizen of the planet and a human being more so than, you know, I am an American, but that used to be at the top of the list. Now it's a little further down the list. And I remember having this experience when I became a parent, and you know, my daughter was in 1st or 2nd grade, and they're doing field day out in the field, and it opens with the pledge and the national anthem, and I'm thinking, I don't even feel this way anymore. I don't feel like there's something moral about putting America first. If we could say the American standard of living can be here, and some other country's going to be down here, or if we could lower ours a little and raise theirs, what's the more moral thing to do? You know, is your duty to your fellow man, or is your duty to country first?
And this is the challenge with nationalism and patriotism. I love America. I think it's a great country. I think it's got a lot going for it. I think we've been a model of progressivism for the world, and I love that. But I am, as a humanist, I'm not prepared to say that a human life in my own community is inherently more valuable or worthy than a human life on some other continent. And so this really is an example of a practical struggle.
In fact, wouldn't you go so far as to say it is immoral to claim that an American life is worth more than someone born in the slums of Calcutta?
Absolutely would say that. And so for me, the shift to the left has gone as far as me saying the words now. I really would say I'm a progressive in a lot of ways. I recognize that the structural dichotomy in the world in terms of resources and opportunities has become problematic. And this is, I know that not all atheists agree with this, particularly the libertarian variety that I used to be would throw up all over what I'm about to say. But when I see that structure in the world that systematically preserves...
Are they throwing up arguments, or are they throwing up their lunch?
Both.
Okay.
Mostly their lunch. I would say that this is an example of a social justice problem in the world writ large that we as humanists really ought to try and address.
Right.
And that's something that I've become passionate about. That's something that matters. You know, Kathleen and I, my wife Kathleen and I, have tried to identify as many effective charities as we can, and I can't think of the name of this particular charity, but I'm not making this up. This group provides mosquito nets to people that live in tropical parts of the world to try and prevent the spread of...
Which is the difference between life and death for
preventing
many
the spread
thousands of children.
Malaria. And in terms of dollars spent, it is one of the most effective charities at trying to do something to improve lives in other places. And everybody has to sort of decide for themselves where the line is going to be drawn. You know, I drove here in a Subaru car and wearing nice clothes, and I got air conditioning and 3 dogs at home and a wife, and we have 2 cars in the garage and 1 car parked out front, and there are only 2 humans in the household.
And an airplane in the garage.
And an airplane in the hangar.
Okay.
So everybody's
this is the life of the childless couple.
Right. No children. So everybody's got to decide for themselves where they're going to draw that line. But I really would encourage everybody who's watching to consider what it is that you could do to try and improve lives in other parts of the world. Improving lives in our community is also important, but the world is so much larger, and the disparity in resources and opportunities really is overwhelming, as long as we are not doing anything to try and overwhelm that disparity.
Right.
But human beings can act and do things, and a lot of human beings can do a lot of things.
So let's shift gears again. You and I...
So we've talked about religion and politics. Are there any other
Atheist activism.
Atheist activism.
You and I had made several trips where we have had the chance to interact with large groups of atheists. Yeah. I'm going to use Oklahoma City as an example. So we were at
AA, the American
Atheist, which was it was April Fool's weekend, which also happened to be Easter weekend,
my birthday
2018.
Weekend.
So this was just 6 months ago, and there was a 4-day agenda at the American Atheist Conference, and in that 4 days they brought in a lot of big speakers from all over the country, and workshops and main stage presentations and groups tabling outside, and I heard a whole lot about church-state separation issues. I heard a lot about how do we get the Christians to behave? How do we get them not to want to put 10 Commandments monuments on the courthouse? How do we not get them to not want to pray before city council meetings or congressional gavellings?
A lot of progressive agenda items politically.
Yeah, so LGBT equality issues, gender equality issues, reproductive rights, of course, front and center.
Sure.
And even how do we run secular candidates so that they can be in state houses helping with these changes. So it was a lot of every different way you can imagine. We want to make the Christians behave. We want to get the Christians to stop legislating Christianity in all these ways, as it relates to sexual mores, as it relates to public expressions of faith, as it relates to education, science education, evolution being taught in public schools, all these things. And you and I were not out of step or in disagreement with any of these goals, but what to me was noticeably absent from this discussion, and I'm not picking on AA. I'm a paid member of AA myself, but I think it's typical of the larger community. What I found missing is any hunger to actually deconvert Christians, right? On every one of these problems, the issue is we've got a whole lot of Christians in this country. In fact, the majority of Americans, and they vote and they pass all these laws. So let's get them to knock it off. And I'm thinking you're treating the symptom, right? You're treating the symptom. If we would instead talk these people out of being Christians, then we wouldn't have to get them to stop putting up the crosses because they won't do it.
But so you absolutely nailed it. There are a number of people in our community, and we talk to them when we make presentations, who will tell us we are not comfortable with you advocating for converting Christians to atheism.
Right.
We are not comfortable doing that ourselves either.
Right.
And I can understand.
And those are two different things. I want to unpack that for a sec, because if an atheist tells me, I personally don't want to do evangelism against Christianity. It's not my personality. I live in a small town. My family doesn't know I'm out. I get that. Fine. Yeah. I'm not asking you to.
Sure.
What's interesting to me is that there is a large segment of the atheist community that when we've talked to them
that don't want us to do it either.
That say, not only do I not want to do that kind of activism, I don't want you to do that kind of activism. Yeah. I think it's bad form. I think it just turns you into a preacher. I think that it just pisses off Christians, whatever. Like the idea that I don't want to do it and I don't want you to do it. And my answer to that is, it is so off of the agenda with all the national organizations and all the local organizations that we're not even having the conversation about effective ways to do that.
Right.
What is the effective way to actually talk somebody out of Christianity?
And I think there is an effective way. We ask for a show of hands every time we do 5 claims. Yeah. Show me. Raise your hand.
Former Christians in the room.
Raise your hands if you've had your mind changed.
And yet some of those same people who've all had their mind changed tell you can't change anybody's mind. Right. So that's problematic.
I guarantee if we don't try, we're not going to succeed. And I would argue that it is incongruous for us to celebrate the Pew poll that comes out every 2 or 3 or 4 years when they show the increasing number of nuns, right? No religious preference, the increasing number of secular Americans who don't identify with the religion. It's incongruous for us as a community to celebrate that, and not also be working towards fostering. There's a reason why we don't have statues of Poseidon or Zeus
in the public square.
Because
no one believes in those gods.
Because nobody believes in those gods anymore. Now, if we could add Yahweh to that list,
or prayers,
we would solve a lot of these problems that we're having.
So my wish to the atheist community would really just be, let's have this conversation. Let's
agree.
get this on the agenda.
Yeah,
I am not going to immediately convince everyone that this is a good thing to do, but let's at least talk about it. Let's at least put all our heads together and say, if we were going to try to actively deconvert Christians, if the natural attrition over the next 10 years will be 10%, let's say, and that would be a great number. What if we could make concerted effort and make that 20% in the next 10 years? That would be an amazing victory.
Right.
Even from 10 to 15. So let's have the conversation. What are the effective ways to do this? How can we use media? How can we use pop culture? How can we use branding?
Yep.
How can we use hand-to-hand sort of grassroots discussions?
Right.
There are ways to plant these seeds effectively, and we'll be so much more effective if we get all the minds around the table. But right now we're not even having the conversation, and yet the very people who are the most frustrated with the church-state separation issues this would be a win for them.
Absolutely.
If you could actually have fewer Christians.
Well, it would also be a win if you could find a way to reduce the amount of fundamentalism that informs politics in America. You could also help advance the progressive agenda for the things that matter to us.
Amen. I'm Rex Burks, and I approve this message.
And I'm Owen Younger, Skeptical Texans.